Today, we're going to focus more particularly on the future challenges and the future opportunities for police academic partnerships and enhancing the evidence base. The day is going to fall into two parts, largely. The morning, we're going to hear from a number of very prominent speakers who will contribute to setting out the agenda for us in terms of some of the challenges of the future in policing. And then in the afternoon, we're going to focus particularly on our small group workshops, which are going to be much more open in terms of their content. And the idea is to engage you, the delegates, in discussions. You haven't pre-selected your workshops. They're going to be your workshop will be designated for you, and the idea there will be very much to get you to engage and to help us shape some of the issues and some of the challenges. So I hope that you brought your 4 I's: ideas, industry, innovations, and enthusiasm, and that we look forward to engaging with you across the day. So this morning we've got a number of our keynote speakers. And we're going to start this morning with the 2 directors of the N8 Policing Research Partnerships who took over in May of this year, Geoff Pearson and Ngaire Waine. Geoff is senior lecturer at the University of Manchester, and he's the academic director of the N8 Policing Research Partnership. He's going to go first. And then he's going to be followed by Chief Superintendent Ngaire Waine of Merseyside Police. So I'm going to hand over with no more ado to Geoff Pearson. Geoff.
Thank you, Adam. Good morning, everybody. We have a few slides, but I think only 5 slides. So don't worry, this isn't going to go on too long. I'm going to say a little bit about the N8 PRP post-Catalyst vision, and then say a little bit about the ongoing small grants. Before handing to Ngaire, who will talk a little bit about plans, activities and opportunities going forward. So could I have slide 2, please? As we move out of the Catalyst funded phase of N8 PRP, we're looking to build upon the work that's gone before and also adapt to the new financial and structural reality, with the aim of delivering a long-term partnership that performs for both policing and academics and other relevant stakeholders. So our overall aim is to continue to develop the partnership as a network and a platform for innovative and relevant policing research that has a positive impact upon policing outcomes. Now, in order to achieve this, we put our heads together and had to think about the key strategic objectives and have come up with 7. So first, to encourage policing research in N8 universities to pursue co-production. N8 Leeds in particular will have a role in encouraging scholars to carry out policing research with rather than just on the police. Will help both established and early career researchers to understand and engage with existing police work and approaches to increase the relevance of the research findings for the police and other stakeholders. And this is linked to a second strategic aim, which is to encourage interdisciplinary N8 research into priority areas as identified by the partner forces. So we'll point scholars towards areas that the forces want research carried out in, and not just from traditional disciplines of criminology, policing and law. We want to expand the disciplinary reach of N8 PRP across the institutions. This will help to deliver useful practical findings for the police and in turn help scholars get access to data and increase chances of making a positive impact on policy and practice. Now, these first 2 strategies might seem pretty obvious, why would we be here otherwise? But since I took up the post in May, and in particularly in light of Black Lives Matter and the defund the police movement in the US, it's been suggested to me by a number of colleagues outside N8 PRP that maybe academics should not be working as closely with the police as we have been. Also, maybe that we need to be more aware of the danger to our academic independence and critical edge by working to police rather than academic priorities. And as someone whose initial research was very much carried out on rather than with the police, I can see some merit in these concerns. But these are not new arguments. We discussed these when N8 PRP was established back in 2014. The partnership exists to deliver co-production, collaboration with forces and working with forces to their priorities is fundamental to the success of the partnership. We can't get away from it, even if we wanted to. So long as this research is still peer-reviewed, that remains an important part of the process, then protections will be in place with regards to academic rigour, and N8 academics will remain critical friends of the police, which is key. And so long as N8 PRP is not used in the universities to close down other research with the police in the N8, or in the language of human rights, to have a chilling effect upon such research, then I think we need to embrace what we do in terms of co-production. So in short, I'm not saying here that N8 PRP research will be limited to police priorities alone, but that meeting those research priorities is integral to what we do in N8 PRP moving forward. The third strategic aim is to facilitate access for N8 research across the partner forces. We'll look to help major research projects developed by N8 universities to access expertise, data and support from across the partner forces. And by facilitating access, N8 PRP will help to deliver more rigorous and impactful projects, and it will also increase the chances of those bids to research councils and other external funding sources being successful. Fourth, we'll look to support bids for external funding from N8 and partner forces. Much of the partnership's activities under Catalyst were focused on delivering concepts that were already pre-established by the partnership. But as we move into a new era, we need to look increasingly to secure external funding for co-produced projects. N8 PRP will have to be proactive in providing support through facilitating access and, where possible, providing support in kind through, for example, administrative staffing for projects. 5, to provide a platform for dissemination of N8 and partner force research across all N8 partners and beyond. One problem that's been identified is that research carried out at one force is often not disseminated across the other forces, or if it is disseminated, often it's without providing the tools for those forces to implement the findings. Steve Brooks yesterday talked about the not invented here syndrome. This is something we have to confront. N8 PRP intends to increase dissemination across forces and also encourage partner forces to work more collaboratively with each other in pursuing research projects, for example, when bidding for small grants, which I'll talk about in a moment. 6, we need to improve the policy and practical impact of N8 PRP research. And here, both academics and police share an interest in producing research that's not only rigorous, but also impacts positively upon policy and practice. We already know there's a lot of data out there. Karen Byron from Cheshire talked yesterday about the challenges of mobilising this data. But changing things for the better is one of the aims that the academy and the police have in common. And in my experience, police often underestimate the value for academics of research-led changes. And academics often underestimate the desire and ability of police forces to change. And finally, we need to share research resources, data and expertise to avoid quality and to improve quality and avoid duplication. Better communication, engagement and collaboration across the N8 PRP should cut down on duplication of work and increase the sharing of lessons and experiences from earlier projects. We should help partner forces to identify existing research and expertise to inform decisions on what research projects to support or pursue and who is best placed that they can approach to achieve the best results. So just a few of the aims and strategies as we move forward, and myself and Ngaire are around at the end of this session to answer questions on it. What I'm going to do now, if we can have slide 3 please, is to just talk a little bit about the small grants that are ongoing in 2020-21. So despite the challenges of the pandemic and the ending of Catalyst funding, we have been able to award a record number of annual small grants. In 2020, we have awarded around £120,000 for 6 projects, 2 from our annual small grant call and 4 from the special COVID small grant call. The response to the COVID small grant call in particular was incredibly impressive. Despite a short turnaround time for both applicants and reviewers, we received and reviewed 10 high quality proposals and made 4 awards. We're thankful here for the support of Adam, Leeds and the Office for Students in helping us award so many. These grants are awarded 1/3 by the Catalyst Fund and 2/3 by the new framework of N8 PRP, so by the partners themselves. So on the screen, you can see 4 COVID small grants. These are awards of a maximum value of £20,000. Understanding changing demand for police during the coronavirus pandemic, particularly looking on non-crime demand. This is a project being carried out by the University of Manchester, Cheshire and UCL. Exploring experiences of intimate partner violence and abuse on children, affected family members and perpetrators during the pandemic. This is led by Newcastle University and Durham Constabulary, with Northumbria University, 3 North East and Cumbria NHS Foundation trusts and a local authority. The 3rd COVID small grant, innovative policing approaches to domestic abuse during the COVID-19 lockdown. This is a project led by South Yorkshire Police and the University of Liverpool with Sheffield Hallam University. And then finally, every ticket is a story, ethnic disproportionality and fixed penalty notices issued for breaching coronavirus restrictions. This is led by the University of Liverpool and by West Yorkshire Police, Cumbria Police, Cheshire Police and Greater Manchester Police. So it's one of our biggest collaborations in terms of the partner forces and hopefully an indication of the type of project that we can deliver in the future as we move forward. In addition to these COVID small grants, we have awarded 2 annual small grants. These are slightly larger awards with a maximum of £25,000 per project. And these were awarded back in May. Knife crime imagery and messaging, effective intervention tools or ineffective sensitizers. This is South Yorkshire Police and the University of Sheffield with Thames Valley Police and Sheffield Hallam. And this developed out of our 2019 Innovation Forum on Knife Crime that was hosted at Goodison Park last November, in the days when we used to be able to actually meet in person for conferences of this nature. And the second project, tackling the developing world of OCGs to a multi-agency strategy, particularly looking at prison interventions. This is led by Humberside Police and the University of Sheffield, with the University of Hull, HMP Hull and HMP Humberside. All of these projects are 12 months duration, and all of them will report in October 2021. All projects will produce reports that will be accessible for practitioners and open access on the N8 PRP website, and we'll do everything we can to ensure that the partners who are not party to these projects will have access to data, findings and any tools necessary to implement these if they wish. And can we have slide 3 please, and I'll pass on to Ngaire.
Thanks, Geoff. Morning. Yeah, I'm Ngaire Waine from Merseyside. As Adam said, I head up criminal justice in Merseyside, and I've been involved with evidence-based policing in Merseyside, but not the N8 until I was got the job as the co-director in May, in the middle of the pandemic, and so I haven't actually been able to meet anyone except for Geoff since getting that job. But I have had lots of conversations with people on the steering group, the police box, and that's been really helpful. I kind of wish this conference had been in May, because it's been really good to get the background and to understand more clearly what the Catalyst grant has achieved and what we're building upon. As Geoff says, we've had 1 year's funding. And that had less initiatives, obviously, because it had less money than the Catalyst grant. But there were 2 things that we did have budget for, and that was an innovation forum and data analytics support. But because of COVID, it's been very difficult to progress those things. And while we've done really well on the small grants, it's been more difficult to decide how to address the innovation forum and the data analytics support. when I first came to the partnership, one of the very positive things that Police Spock said was about CPD for analysts within the police, and some of the forces continued funding it on that basis. So it is really important that we look at that area of work. So in terms, and I'm going to jump to data analytics first, I've had difficulty in trying to identify what we do with this bit of work in the future. And I think, having spoken to Police Spocks, one of the key issues for police forces is how they ensure that the analysts have the skills and are utilised to actually create an evidence base for some of the many pilots that we do have in policing. And I think Karen mentioned that in her input yesterday. So what we're trying to do, and Nic, who's speaking later, was involved in one of these meetings, is to look at how we ensure that the skill base for analysts within policing assists them in providing an evidence base about some of the things policing does, but also that there's consistency about how analysts are used, because police forces use them in different ways. And while there is some training out there, there is very little consistency as to what the expectations are of police analysts. So we're looking to have a vision that works in partnership with academic partners to utilise the analysts within policing and to help them identify where academic research is necessary, because there's a gap which is beyond the capacity of the analytic abilities within police forces. So that is something we're trying to develop in terms of a vision, and then commission some work around analysis within policing that would support evidence-based policing. The second thing is, obviously, we have an aim to have an innovation forum, and that's likely to happen around April, likely to be a virtual event, I suspect, as well. But the theme that a small tasking group have decided is about collaboration and partnerships. And I was really pleased yesterday to see that that really fitted in with some of the presentations. Mike Cunningham said, you know, we can't achieve anything in policing without working in partnership. And I went to a workshop in the afternoon about successful innovation in domestic violence and how partnerships there, what made them work. So there's already been some work on this. And I think one of the things that we are looking for is to build on some of the work that's already there, so we get a really deep understanding to enable change that works. So the overall theme is collaboration and partnerships. We're thinking about 3 different areas. First of all, collaboration with other police forces and emergency services, which continue to face difficulty, and there have been a couple of police collaborations that have actually fallen apart recently. So it's really looking at what works for those that are successful. We're looking at partnerships with health and social services within the vulnerability area, which obviously is a very big area of policing, and whether it's mental health or domestic, etc. And the last one is considering again the statutory partnerships with regard to crime reduction and child safeguarding in terms of the safeguarding board. And I think what we're hoping to do with those in that workshop is to explore some questions around the conflict between the policing immediate response and long-term solutions, the balance between policing responsibilities of being an emergency responder, but also investigating crime, protecting the vulnerable, and policing social order, conduct, and the legitimacy that comes from that, and particularly relevant given police role in policing health issues with regard to COVID at the moment. And then linking into that, the question about whose job is it anyway? And obviously vulnerability is a policing role, but in terms of long-term solutions, policing can't do that alone. So that is the aim for the Innovation Forum in spring. The other thing that I'm really working with Police Boxing is this research priorities, and one of the things is to identify priorities so that forces can work work with one another, as well as the academic institutions, so that, such as the fixed penalties for disproportionality, we have a number of police forces working with academic partners, because in that way, instead of being competitive about the small grants, we are much more likely to have outcomes that can affect policy. And this goes back to what Geoff was saying around the not invented here syndrome, and that Steve mentioned yesterday. So I'm really keen for forces to collaboratively look at issues that are priorities across the board for Northern forces. And I think this links into force management statements. For those of you who don't know what that is, every year now police forces have to do a force management statement which says about the condition of their assets, the demand, how well we're meeting demand, what we think future demand looks like, and where are the gaps? Where do we not have enough resources to meet likely future demand? And I'm sure Nic will come into this talking about much longer future demand, because this is the next 4 years, but where there are common gaps across Northern forces, those can be, we would like to look at them as priorities so we get that collaborative effort. And I think the other thing that I've really tried to do as co-director is to help forces articulate what the priorities are. I'm not sure that we've always been that good at identifying the questions and making an approach for academic assistance. More often, the ideas come from elsewhere, and you know, we want to be able to articulate those issues that are gaps, and where academic work can help us to provide better policing services. And this links back to the skills of our analysts and how they're utilised to really make the N8 policing partnership effective and to be seen to be valuable by senior officers, which is what we need for this to continue as a successful partnership.
Great, thank you very much, Ngaire and Geoff. We're going to stick with some of the themes that both Ngaire and Geoff have raised, but shift gear a little bit and put the N8 Policing Research Partnership into a wider context. And one of the things that's been recurrent both yesterday, I think particularly in many of the discussions, has been one of the issues around the different temporalities in policing and in academia, and how we align those two. And one of the things I think the N8 was always set up to try and do was to try and foster within policing a slightly longer term vision, to take stock, to look beyond the immediate, to look beyond the now. And so we're really pleased now to be able to I'm pleased to hand over to Nic Pole, Principal Analyst from the College of Policing, who leads the futures work in the College of Policing. Nic was the lead author of the Future Operating Environment 2040 report published this summer, which if you haven't read, I do encourage you to read. But Nic now is going to give us, I think, a little summary or a taster of some of the insights within that report. So over to you, Nic.
Thanks, Adam. Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen quickly. Hopefully you can all see that. So yeah, like Adam said, my name's Nic and I'm an analyst for the College of Policing. And it's in that role that I co-authored with my colleagues, Sadie Lynch and Zoe Millier, the college's New Futures report, Policing in England and Wales, Future Operating Environment 2040. I'm going to talk a little bit about that today, but hopefully situate it in the broader context of why policing needs to do more thinking about the future. Just like to say before I start, it's an honour to be asked to help open today's session. And if there's one message that I'd like people to take away from this presentation, it's that the future is very much open, and that we each have some agency to shape it. We can all influence the future through what we do or what we don't do in the present. And I think that's an important mindset to kind of have when you approach decision making and leadership, and indeed life in many ways. Okay, so the story of FOE 2040 started 2 years ago with the launch of our new strategic plan, and that plan made futures work a central part of what we do at the college, something that informs the rest of our work on knowledge, on standards and professional development. And to bring that part of the plan to life, we established two programs of work. The first was a program of horizon scanning aimed at detecting emerging issues that may affect policing in the near term, so sort of thinking 0 to 3 years. And the second is our future operating environment work. And FOE 2040 is an analysis of how policing's operating environment might change over the next 20 years and what that change might mean for policing today. So it considers how important trends, value shifts, technological developments, socioeconomic structures might come together to create new challenges and opportunities for policing. Now, FOE isn't a normative piece of work. It isn't a vision or an agenda for the future of policing. We don't put any recommendations in the report. It's an analysis of policing's external environment, so what you might call its future strategic context. And we offer it not simply as a report to be read, but as a set of resources to be used to help policing think more carefully and more creatively about the future. We see it as the start of a conversation which will hopefully be continued within both police forces and within universities. So one of the drivers for FOE 2040 is this idea that navigating a rapidly changing and increasingly complex world requires us to be better long-term thinkers, that will make better decisions today if we have a richer and a more coherent view of what might lie ahead. Or to put it a different way, short-termism, with its focus on immediate results at the expense of more far-sighted action, is in the modern era a source of vulnerability. It's a recipe for unpleasant surprises and for missed opportunities. And there was plenty of evidence for that view in the interviews that we conducted as part of the FOE project, where people would often speak about this tension between policing's current structures and systems and contemporary threats such as cybercrime, terrorism, and transnational organised crime. And it's this notion, I'm sure we've all heard, that policing is kind of destined to always play catch up with the world around us unless it starts to think and act with more long-term strategic intent. And of course, that idea isn't exclusive to policing. Many institutions are struggling in the face of disruptive social, economic and technological change. And it's something that people from a variety of disciplines and from ideological standpoints have been trying to make sense of for several years now, as all of these books illustrate. And while each of the authors of these books offer their own sort of distinctive or individual assessment, taken together, they describe a world where new trends, ideas and crises can emerge in the blink of an eye, and where our ability to understand and act is increasingly being overwhelmed. And that adds up, of course, to big sort of problems for strategy making and for decision making. And this is where foresight comes in, because foresight, as Leon Firth, who was the National Security Advisor to Al Gore, puts it, foresight is knowledge in the form needed to navigate an uncertain world. Forecasting and prediction only work when you know all the variables. And how often do we have the privilege of knowing all the variables? So what we need are concepts, methods and tools that can deal with limited and imperfect knowledge of the future. And that's what foresight tries to give us. It gives us these tools for creating useful mental maps about possible futures rather than the impossible task of accurate predictions. The challenge with foresight is to make it an organisational competency. So to take what is a unique human capacity, evolutionary psychologists describe humans as the apes that can look forward. So to take that individual capacity and to put it on an organisational footing. And that's the journey that we're on in the college, trying to establish foresight as an organisational practice, which connects with and forms a broad cross-section of what we do. Now, the question that we set ourselves with FOE 2040 was, how might policing's operating environment change over the next 20 years, and what might that change mean for policing? So our CEO, Mike Cunningham, said yesterday that any exploration of the future needs to be connected to the present. I think he phrased it in terms of addressing the so what for policing question. And that's something that we really tried to do throughout this piece of work. Now, some of you may be wondering what we mean by policing's external operating environment. Now, we didn't have the expertise within the college to do detailed systems mapping. So instead we conceptualized it in terms of these 3 layers, starting with these big sort of socioeconomic, political, technological and environmental drivers of change, and then working our way inwards towards the police institution. And in futures work, we call that sort of outside-in thinking. And we were trying to identify how emerging and ongoing patterns of change, of external change, could shape policing's transactional environment and give rise to new demands, challenges, and opportunities. Producing FOE 2040 took us about 18 months, and it comprised 4 phases of research and analysis. The first phase was scoping and engagement, which involved 28 interviews with chief constables, PCCs, representatives of the national policing bodies, operational officers, and then academics, technologists and futurists. And I think it was only about 40% of our sample was policing or law enforcement. So we deliberately made the effort to take on board a wide range of perspectives. And we came away from those interviews with a set of key future issues and trends for policing and about 400 pages of transcript, which was fun to read through. And the second phase was a literature review, which looked at the key themes that had emerged from those interviews. And because that review looked at other organisations' futures assessments, it used sort of different standards of evidence, I suppose, to a traditional literature review. We often say in futures work that there are no future facts. So we're essentially reviewing what other organisations, what other authors had said about issues such as artificial intelligence, automation, global warming, demographic change, the economy, and so on. The third phase used scenario thinking to map out 4 possible futures for policing's operating environment out to 2040. Now, one of the limitations of a trend-based analysis is it can give you this a very linear view of the future, and that can lead you to overemphasize continuity and underemphasize potential shocks and surprises and discontinuities. And given that we're living through one of those biggest discontinuities in probably more than 100 years, scenarios are a really valuable way of seeing beyond the expected and the linear future, and considering the range of possibilities that the future may hold. And then the final phase was not really a discrete phase, I suppose, but kind of making sure that we were focused throughout the work on the so what for policing, and always making sure that any insights about the future that we gathered were kind of connected back to policing's current mission, priorities, and capabilities. So we're really keen to make FOE a practical tool that policing could use to think about the future more strategically. We didn't want it to be a report that would just be filed away on a shelf and forgotten perhaps until 2040, when a future chief constable picks it up and says, oh, you know what, some of this stuff actually happened. It's a pity that we didn't prepare for it. And our way of mitigating that was to present the work as a set of practical resources that can be used to support strategic planning. So in part 1 of the report, we describe these 10 trends that we think will drive and define the character of policing's operating environment out to 2040. Trends are often described as the active ingredient in futures work because they model the various forces which shape change. And taking the time to consider them systematically can really improve our understanding of how change might influence the outcomes of the decisions that we make. The 10 trends that we describe in the report are shown here. And of course, each of those trends will by themselves have quite far-reaching implications, but they will also come together in ways that create new challenges and opportunities for policing. And if those points of convergence and those cross impacts between different trends isn't part of our strategic analysis, then we're likely to miss things. So in part 2 of the report, we map out 4 possible futures for policing's operating environment. If you haven't come across scenarios before, they're basically descriptions, usually in the form of short stories or narratives, of possible alternative futures. And in a world where it's difficult, if not impossible, to predict, scenarios help us explore how important trends, uncertainties, and choices might play out in different ways. And we don't construct them expecting to get the future right or to pick a winner. We construct them with a view to describing alternative possible futures that we can step into and explore and then learn from. A bit like a strategic fire drill where we can mentally rehearse our responses to things. I don't have time to go through the scenarios in detail. If you're interested, please do take a look at part 2 of the report. The only thing I'll add is that although we write scenarios in a way that differentiates them from each other, because that's how you help people think about different possibilities, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. So the future that ultimately comes to pass will likely contain elements of all 4 scenarios. And if across a set of scenarios you see some common issues, then those are arguably the things that you need to pay attention to now. In part 3, we set out 5 future challenges for policing. These challenges aren't exhaustive. Policing will, of course, face other challenges over the next 20 years. But these are the challenges that our interviewees and the participants at our workshops thought were most pressing, in the sense that they will add new layers of complexity to existing demands and also raise quite important questions about how policing is organised and how it's resourced. Again, I don't have time to go into each challenge in detail, so please take a look at the section 3 of the report. I will, however, say something about one of the challenges that is particularly topical right now, given what's happening after the election in the US, and that's disinformation. So one of my favorite quotes about the future is from the science fiction writer Bill Gibson, who says that the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. And when it comes to disinformation, I think we've already seen a glimpse of the future, and it's quite a synthetic future where the use of disinformation to artificially shape, or to put it more bluntly, to manipulate public opinion is likely to grow in scale and in sophistication. And while of course disinformation comes in all shapes and sizes, I suppose the classic example is the deepfake video, the number of which is currently doubling every 6 months. So as of June this year, there are just under 50,000 deepfake videos on the internet. If that rate of growth continues, there'll be more than 20 million videos on the internet by 2030. And these technologies of mass manipulation have really big implications for policing, including potential increase in offences such as fraud, blackmail, harassment, the demand they create for new technical skills and forensic expertise, the need for policing maybe to counter disinformation, to reassure the public, to protect the integrity of operations, to maintain public trust. And then, of course, the tricky question of how to respond to disinformation that doesn't necessarily reach the level of criminal activity, but nevertheless creates panic or maybe leads to disorder. So looking to the future, policing may need to attend far more to the ways in which disinformation is used to influence people's emotions and their behaviours, whether that's an attempt to benefit financially or to create social division or just to blur the boundaries between what is real and what is fake. But I suppose there's also, we described 5 challenges in the report, but there's also a 6th challenge here, and that's the challenge of how do you turn foresight into action? So slow or inadequate policy responses to COVID-19 haven't been the result of a failure of foresight. A pandemic isn't an example of a black swan. A pandemic of some sort has been widely foreseen for years by governments, by businesses, by medical professionals. The World Economic Forum holds annual pandemic preparedness events. UK government did something similar in 2017. And this quote is from a foresight report prepared by the US National Intelligence Council back in 2004. So the failure really, and this can be seen across the world in a variety of contexts, was not taking seriously the outputs of foresight work and not acting to create contingency plans and to manage risk on an ongoing basis. And of course, turning foresight into action goes far beyond simply answering the so what question. It means overcoming a variety of psychological and structural and cultural hurdles, all of which tend to incentivize short-termism and lock us into the here and now. And so my thoughts on how we might do that in policing fall into 4 categories. So first, I think we need to broaden our time horizons, look beyond our usual strategy and planning life cycles and start thinking 10 or even maybe 20 years ahead. And that doesn't mean we have to lose sight of the present. It just means having a coherent long-term view that we can use to chart a course through the here and now. Second, we need skilled individuals who are able to carry out futures analysis, who can embed foresight into existing processes and who can translate insights into context for those who develop strategy and who are responsible for capabilities. And that requires, I think, senior leaders to view foresight as a critical leadership role and responsibility. I noticed that Joe Biden tweeted a few weeks ago saying that you can't lead without foresight. And third, we need to integrate foresight into our existing organizational processes, because it doesn't work if foresight is treated as an optional extra. I often say that futures thinking should be like a computer operating model rather than an app. It should be something that runs constantly in the background of an organization, feeding into strategic planning, risk management, research and innovation, and workforce planning. And the more that foresight tools and methodologies are part of the strategy and planning life cycle, the more robust the overall process becomes. And then finally, we need to overcome the sort of system immune response that you often see in organizations when new ideas and initiatives are introduced, whether that's for reasons of risk or reputation or fear of the media response. We need to move past the idea that thinking about the future is a distraction from the more important task of responding to the present. It doesn't have to be one or the other. The former can complement the latter. I just want to finish with a provocation, I suppose. Having already set out something of an agenda for policing, and knowing that there's probably a fair few academics in the audience, just wanted to share with you this quote from Geoff Morgan, who is the former chief executive of Nesta and now professor of collective intelligence, public policy and social innovation at University College London. I just suppose I would say, is this assessment fair? You know, should the social sciences only analyse the past and the present, or should they also try to help design the future? Because I'd certainly appreciate some help with the latter, I think. And that's where I'll leave it. Thank you.
Nic, thank you very much. That was excellent, and thanks for keeping to the time. So we've got a number of questions that have been coming through on the chat, and I'm going to maybe slightly rephrase them in putting them to all 3 of you. But there's been a series of questions which probably relate more for Ngaire and Geoff around why only 8 universities in the north of England are part of the partnership. Well, in some senses, that's quite simply answered, which is the N8 is a coalition of 8 vice chancellors from 8 universities that have come together. But I think one of the things that Geoff's slides on the small grants clearly demonstrated is the fact that actually those 8 universities are working with many other universities and other partners and police forces beyond the north of England. So there's a desire to do that, but we have moved into a model, as Geoff and Ngaire were saying, in which the funding comes from those universities and those forces, and therefore it's understandable that the focus of the activity is largely around that. But I'll leave that out there. Ngaire and Geoff may want to come back to that, but let me focus on something that picks up on what Nic was saying, and it seems to me that this is really important work, and that one issue is around, I suppose, scenarios, and I think Nic, you kind of emphasise the importance of the work being descriptive rather than normative. And of course, one of the difficulties of scenarios is often slipping into normative, either dystopian or utopian. Yeah. And I think there's a real effort not to do that. But I think there's often a desire that if we're we're identifying the future, as you rightly said, provokes action. provokes action as to how you do things in the here and now that may influence future. And that is a normative agenda. That is an agenda of what is the good society. So yes, we can describe the fact that AI may become more important, technologies are going to change, but that does raise some quite fundamental normative questions. So there's a kind of a normative background. Much future thinking still does have a utopian or a dystopian kind of dichotomy, within which it often falls. And I think this piece of work tries very well to avoid some of that, but it nevertheless, I think, is a tension that you might want to reflect on. But so that was one question. The other question is probably for all of you, which actually is a reframing of a question that Mark Tyler has raised, which is really about how policing shifts from this a reactive, now-based organization into one in which futures thinking is mainstream, to use Nic, and you identified barriers or challenges, and Mark was particularly interested in actually thinking through what are the barriers and how do we overcome the barriers. And then I'm thinking about the work what Ngaire was talking about in terms of particularly the force management statements and how they might be used as a vehicle to foster the mainstreaming of futures thinking, albeit the time frames are not 2040, they are 4 to 5 years further out. And really how we secure or seek to secure that shift from a now-based reactive understanding to one which is more in line with the kinds of things that you set out. So I'm going to invite you, Nic, first of all, to say something, and then Ngaire or Geoff, if you'd like to jump in after Nic, please do so.
Okay, just so quickly on your point about normative or non-normative. Yes, futures work quickly becomes normative, and the follow-up conversations you want to have are normative questions. You use this analysis of possible futures to try and sort of steer yourself towards a preferred or a desirable future. I suppose one of the ways we try to avoid that coming through in the descriptive part of the work was through the method we used. So there's some evidence that if you present three scenarios, that people will kind of will go for the mid. Yeah, they latch on to the mid one because you describe one positive, one negative, and one that's kind of in the middle. So actually, the decision to present 4 scenarios was partly to counter that. And the method that we used there it's called archetype. So a political scientist called Jim Data back in the late 70s looked through thousands of images of the future as set out in government policies, in opinion polls, in sci-fi, movies, in novels, in academic books, and kind of found that all of those vast variation in images could be boiled down to these 4 sort of archetypes of the future. And they kind of are a continuation of the present, collapse, a kind of a discipline scenario, which is where people realize the limits of their current lifestyles and behaviors, and they kind of try to address that and live within their means, and then a kind of transformation. And so I think there's a transformation side based on technology. So technology kind of overturns many of our concepts of normality. And I think there's something in that method that kind of helps you get away from the classic kind of presenting either a utopian or a dystopian future. To your second question on kind of overcoming barriers, I mean, I think this is, you have to take small steps with this stuff. I laid out 4 points, which I think are all kind of about doing that. I think kind of trying to integrate into existing processes is probably one of the easiest kind of first steps. We've been asked by HMIC FRS to do a practitioner event with force management statement leads, for example, in January, where we help those practitioners think a little bit about how you use futures thinking to look at future demand, I suppose, because there's a bit of a disillusionment with predictive or forecasting based approaches to looking back at 3 or 4 years of data and then trying to project that forward. And given that we're living through one of the biggest discontinuities in, like I said, in however 70 or 100 years, we need new methods for thinking about possibilities and for surprises. So we're going to do that. I think it's through little small steps like that and thinking what are the kind of existing processes or demands in the strategy or the planning life cycle for police forces, and how can we just integrate some of these techniques and tools into those processes?
Ngaire and Geoff, did you want to jump in on that second question, really about the shifting or the mainstreaming of more futures thinking work in light of, and how I suppose the N8 might foster some of that, what role it can play in fostering the kind of thinking that Nic's been outlining?
Well, I think one of the challenges for the police service at the moment is on understanding and balancing risks. I mean, we've got a huge amount of academic work that tells us that managing risk is increasingly what the police do, and ultimately we're in a position where if you're working in the police service, generally you don't tend to lose your job for not predicting future risks, but if you don't correctly identify and respond to existing risks, that can cause you career damage. And essentially that can lead to, senior officers as well as frontline officers just managing that immediate risk. So going back to the quote that was on Nic's slide from Geoff Mulgan about the problems in academia of focusing on the past and the present. I think that we can say the same, I think, in terms of policing. In academia, I think we're trying to move to become more forward-looking. And I think some of the developments in how research and academia are assessed have, the focus on impact and changing things for the future, I think has been increasingly something that's important in academia, although to what extent that has achieved the sort of change that we could achieve is another matter. But I think there does need to be a conversation within the police force about, within the police service about how future and current risks are balanced, and I think that is something that academia should be part of.
Ngaire, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I think there is a conflict between that sort of long-term future thinking and the sort of the short-term nature of policing. I think one of the reasons the small grants have been so successful is that they're 12 months and you get something in 12 months. And if you do a PhD on something, by the time that's reporting, the people who are probably leading on it and giving the data have moved on to something else, and that is always a problem in policing. I know when I speak to the police spots, one of the things they do see in terms of benefits, and this is particularly Durham, is building work on work. So you've got a small grant about something and then you build another more research or work on that, so that you end up getting a deep understanding of the problem and therefore more effective decision making. But again, it's still quite short term, and I think the force management statements are a way of making policing look ahead a little bit more than they would naturally do within the culture of policing. And I also think that actually partnering with academics and doing some of this evidence-based work, again, makes policing think a bit more about, not every pilot is doomed to success. We actually want to see whether it works and recognise you've got to try and do some analysis. Now, that's not, looking very far ahead, but it is small steps towards a bit of a different culture around how we make decisions and doing things a bit differently.
And just to follow on from that, if I go back to if I reflect back on the first slide that we put up, we talked about the police priorities for research. I'm very keen that we are following police priorities, but as Ngaire suggests, generally that is understood in the context of small grants in particular about being short-term solutions for short-term problems. If the priorities are longer term, then often that is actually more the natural home of the deep thinking academic, and certainly would be willing and able to respond to those as police-led priorities as well.
Thank you. Just a kind of final question, really, in the time we have left for Nic. So we've had a comment from Rebecca Tennyson-Mason at West Yorkshire Police about how they've been seeking to embed the 10 trends that you identified into their force management statement. So very much picking up on the links there. And I suppose the question really, Nic, is about the appetite of and the reception of the report. I know it's relatively early days, but to what extent? Obviously, some forces are picking up on it and using it. And you said very clearly it's a resource, and that was its purpose, to be a resource. So I suppose the question is, to what extent are police forces across the UK responding to that challenge and actually using things like force management statements as a way of integrating some of that thinking, at least, so that, to go to your kind of scenario, that we're not going to be 10, 20 years down the line and suddenly chief constables are thinking, well, why didn't we use the resource? But actually we spend the next years using the resource and trying to mainstream them in the ways that you outlined.
Yeah, I mean, it only published at the beginning of August, so it is early days, but I have been encouraged. I've read tweets from chief constables who've found it useful. One who was reading it while sat in the car waiting to pick up his son, I think it was, from some event. And we've been doing lots of engagement events. The thing with Futures Work is you can't just chuck it on a chief constable's desk and say, here you go and do something with that. You need to follow it up with it. Engagement. We've been doing various events over the last 6 weeks, 2 months, where we've been working with people in forces who we've identified who have some responsibility for kind of longer term planning, policy, strategy, and kind of introducing the work and talking about how it can be used, going through the user guides, identifying opportunities for using it. There's an event actually on Thursday where we've got the national kind of policing leads who are considering some of the issues that are identified in the work as well. So, just going all in, I think, on kind of us being quite proactive in encouraging forces to use it. So yeah, early days, but I've been quite enthused.
Great, thank you very much. And I suppose just the challenge for the N8 is about linking some of this up, because it seems to me that in the realm of futures thinking, universities have significant resources and skills to contribute to those debates, and it's how we try and harness some of that and structure some of it going forward. So listen, thank you, all three of you. Thank you.